8-bit, 16-bit, 64-bit. What is all this bit stuff that we hear about in classic gaming? What does it all mean? Why is gaming history divided up by bits? This could take a while, but I'm going to try and explain. Let's start at the very beginning. What is a bit? Well, it's a binary digit, a 0 or a 1. Computers and consoles work entirely with bits. Everything they do is zeros and ones. 8 bits is 8 binary digits, also called a byte. 16 bits is 16 binary digits or 2 bytes. 32 bits is, well, you've probably got the idea by now, the pattern is not hard to spot. Bits are often used in a straightforward way to measure all kinds of things in computing. 8 bits per pixel graphics means every pixel, every dot in an image is represented by 8 bits. You can have a choice of 256 colours, very common in old school PC games. These days 24 bits per pixel is the norm, giving roughly 16.7 million colours. That's what this video uses, and pretty much anything else on a modern computer or console. There's loads of examples I could give of digital technology measured in bits, and these days it usually tends to be a simple measure of quantity or rate. But bits can mean something bigger than that, a console's power and complexity, how good the graphics are. Whole eras in gaming can be defined by bits. So what does it mean in that context? That's the question I'm going to answer in a moment, but before I get to that, well, you can probably guess which way this is headed by this intro. Yes, it's Ray Spoon, the only cereal with the power of Cobalt 60. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong brief. It is, of course, Raid Shadow Legends. You might have heard of it, the online mobile RPG with amazing graphics and intense PvE boss fights. And can you believe it's Raid's 4th anniversary? Yes, it's really been 4 years, and to celebrate, I'm hosting a party with 4 Raid champions who I think might be a good fit. I'm going with Ursula the Mourner because anyone who calls themselves the Mourner sounds like they mean business. Also, Nekharet the Great because, well, you do need someone great. And Whirlim Frost King because you need someone metal. And to round it off, Underpriest Brogni for the intellectual drive. Yeah, that sounds like a nice evening. But there's loads happening in Raid this month, including the debut of Live Arena PvP. Yep, Raid is letting you throw down live picking and banning champions before dueling to determine the ultimate warrior. And it's bringing some awesome rewards too, new artifact sets, fragments for a legendary Void champion, and special live arena crests that unlock powerful new bonuses at the Great Hall. With all this stuff happening in Raid, if you haven't started playing, well, then what are you waiting for? Use my link in the description or scan my QR code to get insane bonuses, including an epic champion, Kellen the Shrike, and other useful things, energy refills, magic potions, XP brews. Once you're in and crushing your enemies, come find me under the name Chiropolis, and if you're fast enough, you can join my clan. So just hit my link in the description and I'll see you on the battlefield. So thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Right then, back to the bits. And what is an 8-bit console? What's a 16-bit console? Why did every game advert in the 90s mention bits? Why was everyone so obsessed with the concept back then? Well, it starts with CPUs, Central Processing Units, the calculating, number-crunching heart of computers and consoles. CPUs run programs, they execute code, and when you get down to it, all that is in the form of binary numbers, strings of bits. Whether it's 1K chess or Elden Ring, the CPU reads instructions from the memory and carries them out. The bit count, if you can call it that, tells us something about how a CPU works and, by extension, something about the capabilities of the system that it's in. So let's have a look at a real 8-bit CPU, and this is the Rico 2A07 nestled inside a PAL NES. It's basically a version of a chip called the MOS 6502, a really common 8-bit CPU. What's key are these pins, these connectors here. This is the data bus. All the instructions this CPU reads in from the memory, and all the data it stores back there, the result of those instructions, it all comes through here. There's 8 pins, so this is an 8-bit data bus. That's the most it can handle in one go. It chews through data 8 bits at a time, and this is a big part of why we call this CPU 8-bit. That's not the only thing that we can measure in bits though. These pins are the address bus. This is how the CPU requests the data it uses from the memory. It sends the address of the data it wants up the address bus, and the requested data comes in through the data bus. 16 pins means 16-bit addressing, or 64 kilobytes of storage is available. That doesn't mean that programs can't be larger than this, it just means that the CPU only has access to memory in blocks of 64K. And also, we can't see them, but inside the CPU are little pockets of very fast memory called registers that the CPU uses when it's executing code. Sort of its short-term working memory, and in the 6502 these are all 8 bits. That's what is used when it's adding and subtracting and comparing and all the other stuff it needs to do for executing code. That doesn't mean that the CPU can't deal with numbers bigger than 255, it would be pretty useless if it did, it just means that it has to break them up to be able to process them. These are some of the major features that put this CPU in the 8-bit category. The definition isn't totally rigid though, there are other 8-bit CPUs out there that are a bit different, but mostly dealing with stuff in 8-bit chunks is the vibe. We could say the same sort of thing about 16-bit processors too. This is a Motorola 68000 or just 68K in its happy home in the Sega Mega Drive, aka the Sega Genesis, but this appeared in many other game systems and computers too. It's got a 16-bit data bus, so it takes in data 16 bits at a time, but it's also got a 24-bit address bus, giving it access to 16 megabytes in one go. And on the inside, well, it does have 16-bit registers, those tiny pockets of memory, but it also has the capability to do a lot with 32-bit numbers too. It's so good at this that many people will insist on calling it a 16/32-bit hybrid chip, but again we're not really dealing with very rigid definitions here. We're talking about 16-bit chunks as a general rule. A 32-bit chip like this Intel Pentium, the kind of thing you'd find in a mid-90s gaming PC, it has a 64-bit data bus. If you thought you knew where this was going, you might be wrong. Chips in this era get a lot more complex. The address bus on this though, that is 32 bits, and that's usually the case in 32-bit CPUs, giving them access to 4 whole gigabytes of memory. Except when it's not, some chips might have 36-bit address buses or even more than that. Inside the CPU there are 32-bit registers, but also there are 64-bit ones too. Some later Pentiums have registers up to 128 bits, though that's not for dealing with really big numbers but for processing several smaller numbers at once, called single instruction multiple data. Again, the definition of a 32-bit chip can be pretty loose, but we're still broadly talking about dealing with data in 32-bit chunks. And finally, to round things off, let's take a look at a 64-bit chip like a Ryzen 7, common in today's gaming PCs and also very close to what's in the PS5 and the Xbox series. We don't really have data and address buses here in these chips anymore, but instead there's 2 64-bit memory channels connected up to the RAM in parallel, and some 64-bit CPUs have more than that. Inside the CPU there's a whole city of components, multiple processor cores, data caches, ring buses. Trying to talk about this in the same terms as we talk about chips that may be 30, 40 or 50 years old doesn't really make sense. What goes on in here with data will make your head spin, but we do have 64-bit addresses, which means 16 exabytes of RAM is available. That's 16 billion gigabytes, much more than even the world's most powerful supercomputers have, so most 64-bit chips don't actually implement 64-bit addresses fully. 48 bits is common with modern processors. So that's 4 different generations of CPU, and the bit thing, what it refers to, well, it's not a fixed, definite quantity from generation to generation. It's more of a sort of vague hint as to the general architecture, but it's not useless to talk about 8-bit CPUs or 16-bit CPUs, and it's not useless to talk about 8-bit or 16-bit consoles either, because CPUs do fit broadly into families, and so does the gaming hardware that those CPUs ended up in. 8-bit CPUs were the first generation of microprocessors to be widely used, that is, CPUs as single-chip integrated circuits. There was a handful of designs by a handful of manufacturers, Intel, Zilog, MOS, Motorola, and they all had broadly similar characteristics, broadly similar capabilities, and they competed in the same market. They powered the first couple of generations of cartridge-based games consoles and home computers, from the late 70s to the mid to late 80s, from the Apple II to the NES, from the ZX Spectrum to the Sega Master System. These all have 8-bit processors and we call them 8-bit machines. The type of processor doesn't dictate exactly how the graphics will look, but it does tell you roughly how much power a system has, and it tells you something about when it was made and what likely constraints it has. If you're a fan of classic gaming, you probably have a good idea of what 8-bit graphics look like, stuff like this. They're not 8 bits per pixel, by the way. Most 8-bit systems can't handle that much. It means that distinctive style of graphics and sound from the late 70s to the late 80s, Space Invaders to Castlevania 3. It's hard to be really specific, we're just talking about general look and feel. 8-bit CPUs put constraints on how much data can be processed, how much memory can be handled, and that puts general limits on how complex games and their graphics can be. 16-bit CPUs are the second generation of microprocessors, and they were used in the next generation of computers and consoles from the mid-80s to the mid-90s roughly. The Commodore Amiga, the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis, the mighty Super NES, again you probably have an idea of what 16-bit graphics look like, what 16-bit games are like. And again, it's not that having a 16-bit CPU dictates exactly what the capabilities of a game system are going to be, it's just that it gives you a rough idea. 16-bit machines were a huge step forward, and you didn't need to be a tech expert to see the blazingly colourful upgrade that this new technology brought to video games. As a wide-eyed gaming kid, you might still be baffled by how it all worked, but you probably had an idea what 16-bit meant. It became a buzzword that marketing people and journalists were quick to leap on as a useful shorthand for the new generation. Why was the Sega Mega Drive better than the 8-bit NES? Well, it's 16-bit. It says so on the front. That was all you needed for playground gaming discussion. More bits equals more good. And 32-bit processors, well, the bit buzzword thing wore off a bit by this point in gaming history. You don't hear anything referred to as 32-bit quite so often. Strictly speaking, 32-bit processors and 32-bit systems cover a lot of ground, anything from late 80s PCs to the Wii U to many smart devices still in production today could be described as 32-bit. But if you limit the 32-bit generation to being what came immediately after 16-bit from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, it does make some sense. There are some common threads. The PlayStation, the Saturn, Pentium PCs, the rise of 3D gaming, the massive boom in first-person shooters, early open-world games. The beginnings of the modern GPU or graphics processing unit, CD-ROM and then DVD-ROM technology, analog, controls, all things that I think adds up to a pretty coherent sense of an era. But what about 64-bit? That's got to be where we're at now, basically. The power of CPUs in gaming has become less critical than what kind of fancy GPU you have, but they're still of major importance. Maybe we can still use that as a category. From the PS3 and the Xbox 360 onwards, CPUs in consoles and gaming PCs have generally been 64-bit. It took Nintendo a bit longer to catch up, but the Switch, released in 2017, is also a 64-bit system. But that said, when you think about 64-bit Nintendo products, the Switch is probably not what comes to mind. Yes, this thing might be a bit more prominent. So there is a dichotomy here. What exactly 64-bit means is open to question. 64-bit gaming could mean GoldenEye, or it could mean Red Dead Redemption. Quite a big leap, but if you start to examine this whole gaming classified by bits thing in detail, it is on pretty shaky ground. It's general trends and vague overviews all the way down, not scientific taxonomy. The N64 really is 64-bit, depending on how you look at it, but that is debatable. Without getting bogged down in really tedious detail, wow, is its CPU very different from modern 64-bit processors, and it's much more like its 32-bit contemporaries. It also has a 64-bit GPU, maybe, but that's a whole other story, and it tells us even less. If you look at the capabilities of the N64, what it can do, what its graphics are like, it's part of the 32-bit generation, surely. The original PlayStation at totally 32-bit can outpace the N64 in some ways, and definitely the 32-bit GameCube can. But then again, for a lot of fans of the N64 era, 64-bit means grey cartridges, Vaseline filtered textures, and the unforgettable, groundbreaking games of the N64. Maybe that is more important than playing gotcha with obscure technology trivia. In fact, there are loads of but actually moments in this topic, things that might lead to strange conclusions if you start to get really pedantic. NEC tried very hard to make their TurboGrafx 16 sound 16-bit. When it launched in the late 80s, they had to, going up against this, but it actually had a totally 8-bit CPU, a variant of the 6502. Advertising claimed that it had a 16-bit graphics processor, which it sort of does because that could mean anything you want it to mean. There's not even a loose definition of what a 16-bit graphics chip might be. They don't fit into families like CPUs do. But to be fair, calling the TurboGrafx 16 a 16-bit system really does make perfect sense. Given what it can do when it came out, its CD-ROM add-on, its amazing Street Fighter 2 port, it fits the profile perfectly. This is a generation ahead of the NES, both chronologically and in terms of graphics and sound capabilities. A look at some of the system's games will tell you that very quickly. And even though the CPU is 8-bit, it's got a high clock speed, and it is actually perhaps more powerful than some 16-bit ones. That's not typically the case, but it isn't totally surprising that this could happen. The bitness of a CPU doesn't give the whole story. I've seen a benchmark that puts it as being faster than the processors in the Mega Drive and Super NES, in fact, quite a bit better than the Super NES. In fact, hold on, now I come to mention it, does the Super Nintendo actually have a 16-bit CPU? Let's take a look inside my very own console, and, well, let me check the diagram. It's 8-bit. It's got an 8-bit data bus. They lied to us. They lied on the box. Maybe. Yes, okay, I did say having an 8-bit data bus is a big part of being an 8-bit CPU, but I also said there's no solid definition of one either. Yeah, it's pretty complicated. The Super Nintendo CPU is a Western Design Center 65C816, catchy name, and yes, it does have an 8-bit data bus, but there are good reasons to call it 16-bit. particularly the way it handles 16-bit numbers internally. That puts it more in the 16-bit category. Plus, it's not that unusual. There are other CPUs like the Intel 8088, found in the first IBM PCs, which do have 8-bit data buses but are still usually thought of as being 16-bit. But on the other hand, if we call the Mega Drive 16-bit with its 32-bit registers, well, we could have a long and totally unproductive discussion on what makes a CPU 8-bit or not. But to call the Super NES an 8-bit system, well, it doesn't make sense. It's the next generation NES, the clue is in the name, with massively increased capabilities. It fits the 16-bit generation perfectly in every way, not just typical 16-bit graphics, but actually at the high end of what you could expect. If we really start to get pedantic, we'll end up saying there are no 16-bit consoles at all, apart from the Mattel Intellivision from 1979, which does have a very 16-bit CPU, one of the very first ever made. Nintendo weren't being deceptive at all with either the Super NES or N64 marketing, and even NEC with the TurboGrafx 16. I think we can definitely give them a pass on that. Lots of other system manufacturers in this era, though, did play very fast and loose in how they described what they had on sale. The Neo Geo claimed to be 24-bit, which isn't a thing at all. Even weird Soviet computers from the 50s with base 3 logic didn't try 24 bits. It's a 16-bit machine, surely another one with a Motorola 68K. It does have a 24-bit bus connecting the graphics ROMs to the video chip, which has to be one of the least exciting things you could say about the Neo Geo. But it's so amazing, such a monolith of 90s gaming. If SNK want the Neo Geo to be 24-bit, well, it can be 24-bit. And what about the Atari Jaguar? That's claimed to be 64-bit too, but 3 whole years before the N64. Was it? No. Its CPU is the Motorola 68K once again. Everything used that back then, and however you describe it, it's not 64-bit. The Jaguar does have 2 32-bit co-processors, and one of them has a 64-bit thing in it, but well, let's be kind, it was Atari's last roll of the dice and it didn't work out. They tried to come up with a CD add-on, but it just made it look like a toilet. We'll go easy on them, give them a clap, and we can make it an honorary 64-bit system. What about the PS2, the daddy, the biggest selling console of all time? Surely Sony were above all this kind of stuff? Well, actually, apparently not, because they claimed that the PS2 was 128-bit. Was it? Well, no, not really. The CPU, called the Emotion Engine, it probably is sensitive and misunderstood, but 128-bit? No, there's never actually been a 128-bit CPU. No one's made one even to this day. It does have 128-bit registers, but it's that single instruction multiple data thing that I mentioned before, common in lots of CPUs from the 32-bit era onwards. You could call it 64-bit, you could call it 32-bit, but I suppose it really doesn't matter now, but I can see why Sony wanted to call it 128-bit though. The N64 had already co-opted the 64-bit moniker, and they obviously wanted to make it sound more advanced than that. In fact, sometimes the whole mid-90s N64/PS1 era is called the 64-bit generation, so you could call the PS2 era the 128-bit generation if you wanted. In fact, I'm sure some people do. The Dreamcast also claimed to be 128-bit as well, and again, it's not really a 128-bit based machine, it's just someone going through the spec sheet and looking for the highest number. So what have we learned from all this? Well, if you thought this is 8-bit, this is 16-bit, and this is 64-bit, well, that might be as good an answer as any. Unless you're talking about very specific computer engineering applications, the whole bit thing is extremely loose at best. You can use it to talk about eras, you can use it to talk about general capabilities, but it's mostly just marketing from way back, or these days, enthusiast jargon. It's not meaningless, but don't put too much stock in it either. This whole bit thing isn't necessarily the whole truth. Yes, of course, with regards to modern CPUs and operating systems, it's a different topic, but the whole 32-64-bit transition was quite a big thing and very real. And there are other areas in computer science and digital electronics where these bit distinctions are better defined and much more critical. Times when the bit count isn't just a marketing buzzword, but that is way out the scope of this video. Thank you so much to my patrons on Patreon. Your help is huge, it makes a lot of difference to me, and if you would like to join them, that would be fab. There is a link below. It helps me out if you send a quid or $1 my way. So thanks for watching, thank you for getting this far. If you haven't done already, maybe hit that subscribe button, and I will say goodbye.